It was really reliable, and it had done a lot of good service, Miss Tucker said, sadly saluting her cube.
I hope they refund that lady.
Usually this is a pro-cube podcast. But...
Oh, yeah. I was about to say, this is not an anti-cubing stance from my point of view. This is...
not anti-cubing or anti-cube.
No, but in my opinion...
Big fan of the action or the platonic solid.
Yeah, and in my opinion, this was an unjust cubing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be cubing from home for the next...
CFH.
Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here with my co-host, most recent champion of the Gold Cube, Maddox.
It's quite an honor and a privilege to be here as the champion of the Gold Cube.
You get to have that crown on until at least the next draft, and given how much Daniel works, it could be a minute, so you might just be holding this crown for a while.
I'm not happy about that. I mean, I would like to keep the crown, but I just actually really want to draft that cube again. It's such a blast to play.
Now, do you always force aggro like I do?
I wouldn't say I force it, but I would say I have a proclivity towards it.
It's one of those things where I don't think I force it either, but... I value those cards so much more highly than so many other people, and that I end up in that deck a lot, just because that's where my card evaluations are at.
Absolutely, and I definitely first picked an aggressive card and was looking to be there, so yeah, sure, I forced it.
For those of you who aren't aware, this is the Gold Cube of a friend of our play group, Daniel. Been on the show a couple times before, and the notable thing about this cube is it is a gold cube. All the cards are gold. But importantly, you start the game with a Pillar of the Parens in play, which is a 5-color land for casting gold spells, which means you can play really interesting decks where basically you play 1 or 2 colors, but you splash all of the other colors. So you can be a mono-red deck as long as all your spells are red-white, red-black, red-blue, or red-green, and you can cast them all with that off-color Pillar of the Parens.
I think I did, so there is a little bit of a challenge there. Like, I love that level 1 of just completely reinventing the way that you evaluate cards and navigate the draft. That's awesome. I think I did do a little bit of a step up in my drafting this time in that you have a problem when you do that especially in aggressive decks where you have a lot of cheap things. And remember, like, all your 2-drops are now 1-drops. So you can, play a whole bunch of cards that are very efficient and do all kinds of complicated things on turn 1. But you get into the challenge where it's really, really hard to double spell, because if you're thinking, okay, I'm drafting red-white, and here's a card that's white-blue, and here's one that's red-green, you might be able to cast them both on turn 1, but you can't necessarily cast them both on turn 2 or 3 because you're relying on that same pillar to be able to cast that splash color in both. So I think I did a much better job of actually taking a bunch of 2-drops and 3-drops in my colors, so I could much more reliably double spell, which just made a proactive deck much more effective.
You mean in your actual 2 colors, so you were green-white, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And you took actual Selesnya gold cards as opposed to just cards that are green or white plus another color.
And like you said, I just know I have a much higher proclivity to taking those green-white cards than anyone else in our play group, so they certainly came around to me.
I think that's the best aggro color pair in that cube. I do like green or red quite a bit.
I like them both.
But the thing is, when you cut your whole curve down by a whole pip, the green creatures look really appealing because, again, it's all 2s, 3s, and 4s. Mostly 2s and 3s. Really good point. And the green 2 and 3 drops are just extremely well statted. I love to read those cards.
I also had some nice scalable things and some face burns. So yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of little tools to actually close out the game as well.
If I can give you one last tip maybe for playing that cube, maybe a very small level up. Draft as if you're playing 1 or 2 colors, but then when you actually build your mana base, actually count all the pips and all the colors and just throw in basics of those colors, and it pretty much just works out.
That might be a good idea. I like just keeping it simple and just everybody's trying to figure out their hard mana bases, and I'm just like, I'm done, give me my basics.
It is nice to be like, give me 12 mountains and I'm done. But that's all I need, by the way, because I get a land and play for free, so I'm not even playing that many lands.
The other thing that's a little bit challenging is I don't know how to evaluate the multicolor lands. That's a whole thing. Like, a lot of it is slow mana, so I don't really want it, but it really would iron out those situations. I had an Ancient Ziggurat, which just felt great.
Yeah, that really works with their creature-based deck. This is not a podcast about the Gold Cube, though. This is our second set review for Innistrad Crimson Vow and Crimson Vow Commander included as well. And what we're doing in this episode is talking about the cards from Crimson Vow and Crimson Vow Commander that Anthony and I are interested in adding to our respective cubes. So we're going to be talking about the community response, maybe next week, maybe the week after, depending on timing. So make sure you complete that survey and send in your hot takes, voice memos to mail@luckypaper.co if you want your voice to be heard, quite literally, in the community episode. But this episode is really just about the cards that we like for our own cubes with that context in place.
Context.
This is a new episode we're trying out for the set review, and I'm excited about it, Anthony. I feel like it helps simplify the conversation. We can just talk about the cards we like or don't like and don't have to worry about trying to contextualize everything in this much broader, complicated structure.
Yeah, I mean, Cube is a weird format where the context it's vague, it's broad. Like, the context can be whatever you want it to be. You can put any kinds of collection, any kinds of custom rules or restrictions on the cube. So we a lot of times want to kind of try and be contextless. So I think that just trying to hit a bunch of different contexts and talk about different cubes and why we're looking at the set in different ways is just another way to maybe do that with a little bit more concreteness.
So we're going to start with my Bun Magic cube. We'll start with my cube. We'll do your cube second just to keep these conversations nicely contained so the context doesn't shift in the middle of our card evaluations. I have 10 cards I have earmarked for the Bun Magic cube. Admittedly, a couple of them I think I'm going to test in the sense that I'll do a testing session where people are allowed to play these cards if they want to, basically. And I'm not sure that some of these bottom ones are actually going to make the list. I'll make a cut for them, permanently, but I'm going to be willing to test them basically and give people access to them during our next draft. So we'll start basically, I've got them ordered here by how excited I am about them for my cube, working from testing but skeptical all the way up to like, this is a card I expect to play for a very long time. Before I dive into the specific cards that I am going to test out in my cube, I want to talk a little bit about the context of the Bun Magic cube. I've talked about it a lot on the show, so if you're a regular listener, you probably know a little bit about this cube, but it's my primary cube. It started out very much as a like vintage cube in the shape of the Magic Online vintage cube that I was watching people play on YouTube and really enjoyed and wanted to be a part of. And over the intervening 5 or 6 years, it has gotten further and further away from that, and really now is a very lean, low curving, high removal format, which has a lot of fixing. So I play about 70 plus fixing lands at 360, which is well above the average on Cube Cobra. I really want players to be able to cast their spells. I want to let people occasionally dip into 3 and 4 color decks if possible, and a really heavy support for aggro. So a lot of 1-drops, a lot of 2-drops, and mono white, mono red, 2 color decks in the white, red, black color combinations all could be very aggressive and get you dead very, very quickly. So, this is a very powerful cube. I'm looking at some of the most powerful cards in the set, but I'm not just blindly playing whatever powerful cards exist. I exclude a lot of cards that would be powerful enough for my cube. I just don't like their play patterns. I don't think they make for particularly fun decisions. I've just left them out because they're not the kind of gameplay I'm trying to encourage, which is this low curving, lots of game actions, lots of decisions kind of environment. Did I explain that well enough, you think, Anthony?
Perfectly.
Great. Let's dive into the first card then, which is maybe a bit of a surprising one. It is by invitation only. This is the new white board wipe. It's 3 white for a sorcery that says choose a number between 0 and 13. Each player sacrifices that many creatures. Now, given the context I just provided for my cube, I care a lot about the mana efficiency of spells. I will always run the cheapest version of an effect that I can. Not just because it's powerful and, is very likely to be better than the more expensive versions, but because I want to encourage people to multi-spell. I want to eliminate as much as I can the chances for people to lose the game with cards still in their hand they never got a chance to cast because they didn't get enough mana. And so I like 4 mana board wipes and 3 mana board wipes and the 1/2 mana board wipe in Balance that we have access to. I play Balance, Toxic Deluge, Wrath of God, those kinds of cards. Right now, I do also include Doomscar, which is the 5 mana board wipe that has Foretell. And by invitation only is in my list just because I want to try it out in place of Doomscar, which I think is the least appealing board wipe in my list right now. I do think Doomscar is overall going to be a lot better in the control decks. The opportunity to, foretell it early and then cast it for cheap later for only 3 mana on a turn where you can maybe double spell, maybe also hold up a counter spell after casting it, or cast it and play a Planeswalker or something, makes Doomscar a little bit better. But what I'm really interested about by invitation only is that it is a board wipe that it's not a total blank in a deck with creatures in it. You can play by invitation only in a creature deck, and I honestly think that time may prove to show that this is perhaps best in a creature deck, because basically what it says is, if you have more creatures than your opponent, just make them destroy all theirs and keep your best ones, however many left you can possibly keep. And so the fact that it's a board wipe that perhaps a green-white deck might happily play is very interesting and appealing to me.
I think the best way to talk about this card is really as a modal spell. So, I mean, it's basically a board wipe. You can just name any number, destroy all creatures. Technically,
we should mention, you
can't destroy more than 13 creatures. I'm going to call that flavor text, and for
it definitely is in my cube.
situations.
I have never seen a board even remotely close to that large in my cube, at least in the past few years.
So, assuming we can sort of rule that out, it basically says either it's a modal card. You either destroy all creatures or destroy a number of creatures, which is very different, I think, from a traditional board wipe because it has this second mode. And I think that second mode is fairly narrow because you do have to be in a fairly specific board state where both, you have more creatures or you have creatures where your best creature is better than your opponent's creatures, but still adding, like you say, that second mode that is not a total blank when you're potentially ahead in the game is potentially very powerful, especially because it is relevant at such a different point in the game. We see a lot of modal spells, if those two modes overlap a lot and are useful in the same situations, that doesn't really increase the power level of the card that much.
Right.
But when the modes are different in very different situations, that does make it a much more impactful card.
Yeah, and I've had board wipes, like traditional board wipes, in my green-white mid-range decks, and occasionally brought them in against aggro and just said, maybe this will be my opening hand. Maybe I'll just sandbag it and get the aggro deck who doesn't think I can afford to run a board wipe. And the fact that you now just you can just main deck it and it's fine. It's still not great against control decks for the most part because they are going to kill you by emptying your board completely, and they're probably not going to have a threat in play until a very, very late game, and so that's not really going to be a relevant spell on your hand. Probably have to side it out there, but maybe it edges over from side in when relevant to side out when irrelevant. I'm not entirely sure.
Although even in those matchups, a lot of times those control decks are playing in this cube a ton of planeswalkers, and you can definitely imagine situations where you have a couple tokens, you just sacrifice your token to destroy their one blocker, and all of a sudden you can actually meaningfully attack the planeswalkers.
Yeah, it's possible. So this is the bottom of my list. This is the card I'm most skeptical of. I don't frankly expect this card to be in my cube in a year, but it's got enough interest to it that I want to try it. It's also worth noting that it has a lot of interesting, weird edge cases. So obviously it makes people sacrifice stuff. So it's going to get around hexproof. It's going to get around indestructible. It's going to get around those sorts of effects, which I don't have a ton of left in my cube. There was a time where I had more hexproof and indestructible and non-interactive threats. I don't really have that so much anymore. So it's not going to be as relevant in my environment. The other thing it gets around, though, is other more novel ways of dealing with board wipes. So some decks in some environments, again, not mine specifically, will play sacrifice outlets like Goblin Bombardment and say, okay, if you wipe the board, at least I'm going to deal 5 damage to you. And because by invitation only, the number is not part of a target or anything. You just choose that number in resolution. Your opponent has no opportunity to respond once you have chosen that number. If you have a board where both players have some creatures, you cast by invitation only, your opponent has a Goblin Bombardment or some other sack outlet, they're not just going to be able to sack all their creatures and say, great, now I got some value out of it, because then you just name 0. And now nothing gets destroyed. You basically plague winded them for 5 mana. Anyway, like I said, skeptical, but going to give it a shot, or at least let some of my players give it a shot and see what they think about it. All right, next up, another card I'm skeptical of, but want to maybe give a try is Kessig Wolfrider. This is 1 red mana for a creature human knight. It's a 1/2 with Menace. It has an activated ability, play 2 in a red to exile 3 cards from your graveyard and create a 3/2 red wolf creature token. This fills in that space of aggressive 1-drops. I say aggressive 1-drops. It's not particularly good aggressive body. A 1/2 is not really what you want on 1 mana. It does have Menace, so it carries equipment pretty well, and will still get in for some chip damage in the early turns of the game because it's going to take them longer to get 2 blockers than have 1 blocker up for it. But then it has this late game value of being able to just pay 3 mana and turn extra cards in your graveyard into 3/2 creature tokens. The reason I say I'm a little skeptical of this one is I do think it's pretty bad in both modes. The mode of just being a 1 mana 1/2 with Menace is not aggressively statted enough to be really appealing in my cube. It's not going to do as much on turn 1 as I want your average aggressive red creature to be. And then late game, 3 mana, 3 cards for a 3/2, compared to some big delve spells, compared to Grim Lavamancer, compared to stuff that's going to use your graveyard as a resource in some other way. Making a 3/2 is fine, but I imagine there's a lot of board states where even that is actually not enough, right? Like if the reason you're behind is because your mid-range opponent stabilized and has their Nissa Who Shakes the World ticking up, making 3/2s, even a couple of them, is not going to be enough to get you out of that situation. So I'm interested in this card. I'm always interested in aggressive 1-drops that have late game relevance, and this certainly has a lot more than your average Jackal Pup, but I'm not convinced it has quite enough to make up for the fact that it is not so appealing on turn 1.
I think on power level, I agree. I'm a little bit skeptical of it. I do really like seeing these alternative ways to use the graveyard as a resource. Obviously, we have things like Delve that are just kind of really hard to balance, let's say that, where these cards get extremely powerful at certain parts in the game, but also they kind of can fail when you just don't have that resource available. You just can't really do it. So I like these kinds of cards that scale up in power level in the late game when you sort of have access to this resource that a deck is maybe not otherwise taking advantage of. Similarly, I really liked the creatures in Kaldheim that you had to exile creatures from your graveyard as an additional cost, because again, that was an opportunity for them to add this extra cost, which was meaningful. You could sort of build around it and play around it in a meaningful way, and it just allowed them to make really mana efficient cards that still didn't just mean the games where, you were just able to dump your hand immediately.
Yeah, and those cards oftentimes had a regular mana cost, but could be played cheaper if you exiled a creature in addition to casting it. I'm not sure if you looked at Cobbled Lancer from this set, but that's a card that I am not going to be playing in my cube. It's that 1 blue mana 3/3 that you can draw a card from your graveyard with it, and you can only cast it if you exile a creature card from your graveyard or something like that. And that card I think is quite interesting, and if it were a different color, I might be interested in it for my own cube, because 1 mana 3/3 is big game.
I think I feel similarly. It's like, but in a blue deck in my environment, a 1 mana 3/3 is just a weird thing to have. So I'm
very odd.
It's definitely something that I think a lot of cube designers are going to be interested in.
That one's curious. That one maybe gets my award for I at least am able to evaluate the viability of this card in my own environment.
I also love it's just sort of a build your own centaur.
It's true. All right. That's Wolfrider. I think it's fine. I'm going to let people test it, and again, unless there's some enthusiastic, wow, this card was so much better than I thought, or this card was amazing, I'm so glad I had it, I doubt I'll actually be able to find a cut for it to stick it in there for the long run. The next card is probably the simplest card on my list, but I think it's going to lead to maybe the most conversation, and that is just Reckless Impulse. This is the common 1 in a red sorcery. It says, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. It's 2 mana draw 2, but, not draw 2 if you're going to use them in 3 turns. You got to use them this turn or next turn. There's a couple interesting comparisons for this card. One is Night's Whisper, which is 1 in a black, draw 2, lose 2, which is a card that has been in and out of my cube a bunch. Never cut because I didn't think it was good enough to continue to see play. Just cut because it was very much a known quantity and I wanted to test some other stuff. And I eventually always put it back in. It is currently in my cube and I don't see it getting cut anytime soon. And Reckless Impulse is, I think, very, very similar to that card. It's effectively draw 2. There's a little bit of downside on both of them. In the Night's Whisper's case, you lose some life. In Reckless Impulse's case, you give your opponent some information and you have to use those cards in the next 2 turns. Otherwise, they go away, which is relevant. The other card we compare this to is Light Up the Stage, which is the Spectacle Claw. It's basically a red divination, exile the top 2, play them this turn or next turn, but it has a Spectacle cost for a single red. That's a card that has also been in and out of my cube a lot, but it was cut because at times I didn't feel like it was good enough, and it is currently not in my cube, but it's always kind of sitting in that stack of cards that might make it back in. Except I think it's never going to make it back in now that Reckless Impulse exists, because I think Reckless Impulse does everything I wanted Light Up the Stage to do a lot better. So Light Up the Stage, obviously a very high ceiling. 1 mana, draw 2, I say draw in scare quotes, is excellent. There's no card in my cube that draws 2 cards for 1 mana without a bunch of hoops or complexity to it. So that mode is obviously incredible. The 3 mana mode, on the other hand, is really rough. A 3 mana draw 2 in my environment is not anywhere near efficient enough. You can't afford to take turn 3 off and just draw 2 cards and not affect the board and not do anything. So really, Light Up the Stage is unplayable in a control deck. And in an aggro deck, if things aren't going your way, it is not only not going to help you get out of that bind, but it's going to be actively bad for you because there's a card in your hand that is well below rate for the environment. So Reckless Impulse I really like because it's right in that sweet spot. A 2 mana draw 2, like Night's Whisper, I think is right, kind of like it's a solid C in my environment. Like, you're happy to play it. It's not, you're not going to be pulled into a color pair because of it or anything, but it's a very solid playable, probably never getting cut from a deck. The other thing I like about it is that the play patterns of Light Up the Stage always felt kind of rough to me. So I have a lot of like blue-red and blue-black like tempo-y decks that have triggers on spellcast or prowess or something going on. And so with those prowess things, you really want to first main phase your spells if there's no reason to do them second main phase, and you can't do that most of the time with Light Up the Stage because you want that spectacle cost. So not being able to trigger your prowess creatures or whatever was kind of a cost. I also have a lot of haste creatures, and so being able to draw your cards, hit your haste creature, play it, and still attack is pretty relevant. And then just having a much better floor, I think, is going to make Reckless Impulse more appealing. So the question for me is really, I think this is much better for my goals than Light Up the Stage. The question is, does moving this effect to red make it better, worse, stay the same than something like Night's Whisper? I know you've had a chance to play with some Reckless Impulse as a pre-release. I have as well, Anthony. What do you think about Reckless Impulse in my cube?
I think it's going to play very well. I mean, I've honestly always been a little bit surprised by your evaluation of Light Up the Stage. I do agree with all of those details and nuance that you just described. And I think you've made me think a little bit more about like where Spectacle, I think, really pays off in terms of like fun gameplay. So that being said, yeah, I think Reckless Impulse is kind of like you're not going to be casting on turn 2 is the thing. You're going to be casting on turn 4 or 5 when you're running out of cards in your aggro deck. And it's just going to give you a lot of late game power.
Yeah, there's very few decks or situations I can imagine where I'd want to be casting Reckless Impulse on turn 2. Maybe if I'm desperately digging for a land in my like blue-red control deck, I would do it. And I guess that would be turn 3 at that point if I'm digging for a land, because I would not have 2 mana and also need a land that turn. So it's hard for me to imagine Time Surge being cast on turn 2. It's either going to be in a deck where it's late and I've already got my board developed and I've got lots of mana, so whatever I draw I can play, or I've already got my triggers in play, my spellcast triggers, my prowess creatures, my young pyromancers, whatever, and I want to trigger them and also keep churning through my deck. It does kind of pale in comparison in terms of card quality to a lot of the blue card selection and cantrips, but yeah, I don't know. I think it's got a place in my cube. Will probably be there for a while. The card overall is kind of uninspiring to me. Like, I don't love the art. It's, kind of a bummer to give your opponent information, I guess, when it's effectively just a draw to. It does play a little bit worse with counter spells, though. I do think there's a lot of situations where your opponent is just going to see you flip a counter, you have mana to hold it up, and if it's just not going to cast anything next turn, that's not even a horrible fail case for it. If it just reveals cards and your opponents then are forced to not cast any spells the next turn.
I'm always going to be casting into a counter spell.
Right. I think a lot of times you're just going to have to do it. So yeah, I don't know. It's down at the bottom of my list just because I hope to get more exciting red cards that allow me to flex into different kinds of directions in the future, but for now, I think it's an appealing enough option to make the cut.
Should red have divination, though? That's the real question.
Yeah, well, you only get 2 turns to use them, so
yeah.
I'm not as concerned
red now.
I'm not as concerned about that kind of color pie stringency in my environment, though I do not like to just blatantly ignore stuff like that. I don't play Mana Tithe.
Well, people like playing Mana Tithe.
People love playing Mana Tithe. People love Mana Tithe and they hate Force Spike, and I get in fights about it in our play group all the time.
That's so true.
All right, next up is Ulvenwald Oddity. This is, frankly, the card I think Questing Beast should have been. It's 2 green for a 4/4 with trample and haste, and it has 5 green to transform Ulvenwald Oddity, and it transforms into an 8/8 with trample and haste, and it gives other creatures you control +1/+1 and trample and haste. There's not a whole lot to say here. It's a very potent 4-mana threat. The fact that it's got trample and haste makes me very confident that in most circumstances I will get some value out of it. 4-drops have a high bar to clear to get into my queue because I have so much removal running around. And this one does just die to removal, of course. But if you can get them tapped out, if you have them on their back foot, then it does have haste and will at least get in there for something. And it's also a mana sink. I love mana sinks in my environment because it allows me to include bigger, splashy, or more expensive effects without having to include big, splashy, expensive cards that are often dead in your hand, as I mentioned in the context section. So if I had any more 6 or 7 drops to cut for this, I would be happy to do it because this is a 4-drop and a 7-drop, kind of. I mean, not really, because if you draw it on 7 mana, you have to play it as a 4-drop first and then untap and do it again, unless you have 11 mana.
So maybe it's a 4-drop and an 8-drop.
Well, 11.
Well, I was thinking you could... It's an 8-drop next turn?
It's a 7-drop next turn.
Right, but I'm saying if you draw it, then you're casting it... Never mind.
Once you get to those numbers,
really
it's not tied to the number of turns anymore. You're not casting 7 drops on turn 7 most of the time. It's either before or well after. Anyway, I think it's perfectly fine. The reason I have this on my testing list is because right now my 4-mana threats are largely planeswalkers, and for a variety of reasons, I'm interested in maybe slimming down on those a little bit, and so I might give this a shot as just a nice, clean 4-mana beater. It just punches your face in. That's all it does.
You've been skeptical about double face cards in the past, right?
Yeah, these are the ones I don't mind as much, where the backside is both much less relevant to the card evaluation, and you can tell from the front side alone that the backside is going to be a huge giant bomb, and you'll probably win the game if it doesn't get removed, because you can see it costs 7 mana to flip it, and you can see it's an 8/8 on the front side. So the extra text, kind of irrelevant. It might as well say you win the game. So at this point, it's like you play it for the front side. You can see that the backside there is this huge upside if you get to 7 mana, but it's not going to really affect your evaluation in a draft or anything like that.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
All right. This is kind of the line where we're moving from cards that I'm skeptical of. Those first 4 cards, I'd be surprised if any of them stayed long-term, but I'm going to test them out anyway. These next 6, I'm more excited about, and I think have a life in my cube for the foreseeable future. The first is Graf Reaver. This is that 1 in a black 3/3 with Exploit, and when you exploit a creature, you destroy target planeswalker. At the beginning of your upkeep, Graf Reaver deals 1 damage to you. We talked about Exploit on our Mechanics and Cycles and Themes episode for Crimson Vow, and this was the card I was primarily thinking of when I was thinking of the fact that Exploit is oftentimes just a modal ability that you can play in decks irrelevant of any kind of tokens or sacrifice synergy where you would think, oh, I need to have a deck that wants to sacrifice creatures for the Exploit cards to be good. This one is either just a reasonable body, a 2-mana 3/3 that deals damage to you every upkeep, or it's a sorcery that says destroy target planeswalker, which is a pretty reasonable place for modal spells to be. I think I would have been really excited about this card and had it really near the top of my list, let's say 12 months ago or 18 months ago, because for a while on my cube, I really like planeswalkers. I like the way they play, I like the decisions they lead to, and how they sort of cause games to naturally reach a conclusion without encouraging board stalls. And for a long time, though, I felt like planeswalker removal was a little bit lacking, and I really wanted to cut down to the games where it just felt like whoever resolved the planeswalker first or the most planeswalkers won. And so for a while, I was really seeking that kind of planeswalker removal. But frankly, in the past couple of years, I feel like we've gotten so much good planeswalker removal that it's no longer a primary thing I'm seeking. So looking at this card, I think it's reasonable as a sorcery that destroys target planeswalker. I think it's reasonable as a 2-mana 3/3 that deals 1 damage to you during your upkeep. I think it's a fine aggressive creature. But I'm not over the moon about it. I just think it's a decent modal card and will probably be fine in any black X aggressive deck or even mono black aggro. And having that mode of destroying a planeswalker, I think, is pretty decent.
I think we've all been a little bit skeptical of black aggressive decks in your cube, but they're sort of starting to take shape a little bit more. And this is definitely, I think, another piece that just really contributes to that.
People have been skeptical. There have been black aggressive decks that have performed very well. I think now with the higher density of fixing I added earlier this year, the red-black deck, for example, is one that I'm really excited about. Red-black deck with Kroxa, all these burn spells, all these black removal and hand disruption, I think could be really, really potent and have a really effective curve. So Graf Reaver might fit in well there.
I'll also give it a shout out. I haven't made any updates to my mono black cube. I'll probably get back around to it at some point, but this is definitely a perfect card for that context, where I'm really trying to make aggro make sense when we don't have all these sort of natural restrictions in the way that decks work. And also one of the biggest problems for those decks is the powerful planeswalkers, so it's a perfect modal spell to reinforce that.
Yep. It do the thing. While we're talking about aggro, my next card is Hopeful Initiate. 1 white mana for a 1/2 creature human warlock with training, and it has 2 and a white to remove 2 +1/+1 counters from among target creatures you control to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So again, training is that effect that says if you attack with this creature and a creature with higher power, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. This is in a similar boat to something like Kessig Wolfrider, where it is a aggressive 1-drop creature that has potential late game value. It's a little different in that it also has potential developing game value, where you can play this early, and it's not going to hit as hard as one of the various 2-powered 1-mana threats that white has access to. But if you can get a counter on it, or 2 counters on it, it can basically grow as the game state grows and remain relevant, as opposed to having these 2 strict modes where it's very relevant early when they have no blockers, and it's very relevant late when you can just start making wolf tokens. This one might be able to basically grow with the game, which is an appealing idea. On power level, I think this is fine. Something I've said a lot about aggro in my environment and with my experience designing cubes is that you just need 1-drops, and warm bodies that do something relevant are going to oftentimes be better than nothing at all. So I'm very happy to play a 3-bit Inspector or a Fairy Guide Mother or an Esper Sentinel, these other 1-powered creatures in my aggro decks that some cube designers have just ruled out completely and said, oh, they have to be Elite Vanguards or Savannah Lions, or I'm not even going to touch them. They have to have 2 power. And I don't feel that way. So I'm okay with the 1-powered creatures because, oftentimes I find they're just crewing vehicles, carrying equipment, doing something. You need creatures in play for all of the aggro stuff to work. And more power is obviously better, but oftentimes those trade-offs are worth it for other reasons. And I'm very happy to have a variety of 1-mana spells, even if Elite Vanguard would be better in my cube in terms of raw power level or some sort of time-traveling supercomputer calculated win percentage. You could prove to me that Elite Vanguard is better and more strong in my cube. I would still include Fairy Guide Mother because I think it's more interesting and allows for more novel deck construction and drafting. And so Hopeful Initiate is something I'm testing in that same spirit. I'm going to cut Isamaru for this, which is the 1-mana 2/2. No other text. It's a legendary cat. And
it's a dog.
It's a legendary dog.
Come on.
Holy crap. Completely owned. What a punt. It's a legendary dog. No other text. And this one I'm excited about because, I think there's going to be interesting opportunities to continue to build this thing up as the game goes on. I'm not playing it at all for that remove 2 +1/+1 counters to destroy target artifact or enchantment, though I'm sure it'll come up sometimes, and that could be cool, I guess.
I'm actually much higher on that aspect of it. Like, again, I think that one of your goals is to create a lot of modal spells, and especially like main deckable answers to things, so you don't just have these like random sideboard cards. And this feels kind of like a perfect fit in there. I think you're also underselling, like, oh, it's a 1 mana, 1 power creature, but it's going to have 2 power, I think, a lot of the time, especially with all the Adanto Vanguards and similar 2 mana 3/1s that are in your cube. I think it's going to be pretty easy to turn this on. I also just love the story here. It's in a mechanical sense, it accumulates these counters, and then it can spend those counters, and then now it can more easily accumulate more counters. So it just mechanically tells a sort of nice story of the way that you can play the card.
Yeah.
And if we want to go deep on the flavor too, the idea of, well, you're just in training, go smash these bottles and see how much more power you can learn from us is kind of delightful.
I didn't pick that up, but I like that. Yeah, to be honest, I've cut down the number of artifacts and enchantments, not consciously, it just kind of happened with my Evolving Cube goals a lot, such that I don't even think this effect is that relevant in my cube anymore. I don't play any Reclamation Sages, anything like that, and nobody has asked for them. It's just not really a thing floating around as much in my environment. So it's kind of incidental when you sometimes get to get like an Asika's Chariot or a Primordial Mist, but there's really actually not that many targets for these kinds of things floating around.
I mean, you could get I guess you don't have so many Oblivion Rings anymore either, but a Smuggler's Copter or a GT, like there's definitely targets.
You can name them. Sure. You can name them, but yeah, there's just far fewer. There's just far fewer than in a lot of Vintage and Legacy cubes that you see floating around. So yeah, I mean, the criticism of this card, which I've heard, which I think is very fair, is that you are in a normal mono white deck. You play this on turn 1. Next turn, you attack for 1 and play a creature that can then train this thing up. You're not going to be able to attack with this thing as a 2-power creature until like turn 3, and then it's a 2/3.
Hello, this is Editor Andy, coming to you from the future, just to say that one thing I neglected to mention, which I wish I had mentioned, is that you don't have to play this thing on turn 1. You play this thing on turn 2. On turn 1, you play your normal 2-powered 1-drop, and the first time you attack with this thing, it's a 2/3. It's basically a 1-mana 2/3, so that's a much better sequence if you can afford it with this bad boy. Play it in place of a 2-drop instead of another 1-drop, Now,
2/3 is a relevant stat line, especially because my cube is very aggressive. There's a lot of aggro mirrors or similar, and so having a 3 toughness creature, I think, is going to make a big difference. And I think it's very relevant. I think there's going to be opportunities to play a haste creature. If you're playing a white-red deck, you play this, then a hasty 2-drop, and put a counter on this and attack immediately. It's going to come up sometimes, I think, where it actually works out in your favor. So I'm interested in these kind of scaling threats, especially ones that make you do a little bit of work, and this is one of those. So we'll see if this ends up making the cut long term, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
You might be talking me into trying it as well.
I'm a little bit surprised it's not on your list, but I've not looked at your list yet, so we're going to see what I think of it in a moment. But I have 4 more cards to get through. I'll try and go a little bit faster. We should make this more clickbaity. My number 4 top card for the Bun Magic Cube from Crimson Vow is...
I don't think you have to make it more clickbait.
It is Cemetery Prowler. This is 1 green for a 3/4 with Vigilance, creature wolf. When it enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. Suppose you control cost 1 generic mana less to cast for each card type they share with cards exile with Cemetery Prowler. I'm going to cut to the chase. I've wanted to put Endurance in my cube, but I really don't like the free cast mode on it. I've actually been cutting down on free spells a bit in my cube, and I just don't like the fact that you can cast it for free. It seems kind of, well, frankly, a lot of time it's going to be flavor text, because there's very rarely early points in the game in my cube where exiling a graveyard is worth 2-for-1ing yourself. So it's kind of flavor texty, and I don't love that it hits the entire graveyard when it ETBs, and here we just get a really strong body. 3 mana, 3/4 with Vigilance is great. I like that body quite a bit. And it is incidental grave hit, which is something I'm trying to up the density of, as more and more and more of the decks in my cube just have incidental value in the graveyard. So that's what I'm playing it for. If it makes some spells cheaper, great. But it doesn't need to do that for me to be excited about this card.
Cool Wolf.
Great. That was a good fast one. The next up is my only card from Crimson Vow Commander, but it's a card I'm also very interested in. This is Occult Epiphany. It's X and a blue for an instant. Draw X cards, then discard X cards. Create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying for each card type among cards discarded this way. So it's a big looting spell. You can, loot 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever you can pay, and then you get to make some number of spirit creatures with flying. This has drawn comparisons very fairly to Secure the Wastes, which is also an instant, also makes 1/1s. Now, those ones don't have flying, but you also are not constrained in how many you get based on the cards you discard. But you also don't draw or discard any cards. You just make a bunch of creatures. Looting is not the most relevant thing in my environment, but as I said, more and more decks are leading towards this kind of inherent graveyard value. And so I'm curious to see if more card selection effects that put more cards in the graveyard could become more and more relevant here. And I'm really interested in this because I think it's a very interesting control win condition. Just be able to late game draw 3 and discard 3 and, make 4 or 5 potentially spirit tokens, because you can get more card types in your graveyard than cards you discarded if you discard cards that have multiple types. If you discard a Phyrexian Evoker as an artifact creature, or Bitter Blossom is a tribal enchantment, or Tarfire is a tribal instant. There are cards with multiple types on them, which means that you can generate more bodies than perhaps it first looks like from this card. So being able to just hold up interaction, hold up counter magic, hold up removal, get to the end of their turn, they don't need to do anything. You just get some card selection and also make some creatures seems like a very powerful card to me.
I'll just add that I do like seeing Delirium is a very interesting mechanic, and it's kind of been isolated a little bit in that it's really just this one thing that sort of cares about card types, and seeing that sort of expanded a little bit in different ways where you just care about card types that you're putting into your deck, I think adds some more space to draft in interesting ways.
Yeah, I have added Tarmogoyf to my cube in the past few months. And really, since I added Dragon's Rage Channeler and Unholy Heat, which both have the actual Delirium mechanic from Modern Horizons 2, I love those cards, and I added those along with Tarmogoyf, and then thought, these cards are working really well, but I don't want this to be this kind of random set of cards that care about this thing that no other cards in the cube address. And so I've actually added a bunch of other cards kind of in the spirit of, let's try and make this caring about your graveyard and caring about the types of cards in your graveyard more of a thing, and Occult Epiphany fits right in with that set of goals. So that's why I'm excited about trying this card. And yeah, I think it's going to be a cool way to, again, provide these, I love control decks that have these, almost incidental win conditions. It's this is already a thing your deck is willing to do, right? Get some card selection at the end of turn at instant speed. We're pretty happy to do that in pretty much any blue deck. And that also coming with some creatures that can possibly just end the game or ambush a planeswalker. If you do have flying, which I think is very relevant, you get to do this on end step. Maybe make enough flyers to get rid of that planeswalker they just cast you didn't have a counterspell for. I think it's going to kind of work out to a nice card that has a lot of opportunities for interesting play patterns. It reminds me a little bit of Shark Typhoon, just because it's scalable, it's instant speed, and gives you a flying creature or flying small creatures. It's just a little bit different in how it actually works. Instead of drawing you a card and making a single shark, it draws and discards and makes a lot of spirit tokens.
Yeah, flying is the huge aspect of this card's power level, I think, because, just think about Lingering Souls. How good would that be if it made non-flying tokens?
It would be bad.
You've never heard of that card.
It would be not great. All right, top two. These two cards I think are the biggest slam dunks for me in this set. And the first is Cemetery Gatekeeper. This is the red creature from the Cemetery cycle. It's 1 and a red for a vampire with first strike. It's a 2/1. Enters the battlefield, you exile a card from a graveyard, and it has this Punisher ability, which says whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell that shares a card type with the exile card, it deals 2 damage to that player. This almost perfectly checks off a card that has been on my wish list for a long time, which I just kind of have shortcutted in my head to red Thalia. I just want a red Thalia-like creature that punishes my opponent for casting instants and sorceries. I say close to because you can't choose instant and sorcery because you have to exile a card from a graveyard and get that sort of effect. But it also has stacked to it the other thing I've wanted for my red section for a long time, which is a 2-mana Ankh of Mishra creature like Zozu the Punisher, but at 2 mana, and this can be that if there's a land in the graveyard. So the only reason this isn't a slam dunk 3, and it's not, I think I rated this at 2.7 or something in my survey, is just because the red 2-drop slot is very deep. There's tons of red 2-drops that would be perfectly viable on power level in my cube, and so I'm always kind of juggling them around to try and find the right mixture of effects that I want. But I love Punisher effects, I love symmetrical effects, I love the incidental Grave Hate, so I think its card's going to stick around for a long time and fit what my red decks are doing quite well.
Easy.
Do you hate this card?
I don't hate this card. Why would I hate this card?
I don't know. Sometimes you hate powerful cards.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you want to guess my number 1 card, Anthony? Can you guess it?
I think your last card is also going to be part of the Cemetery cycle. I'm going to go with the Cemetery Illuminator, the blue one.
All right. I'll cut out the 5 minutes of silence while you try to figure it out. But you're wrong, Anthony.
Great.
I'm guessing maybe you sorted this. I'm guessing maybe you sorted the set by rarity or something, thinking I'm looking for some big, splashy, powerful card.
That's correct.
My number 1 card is Dread Fugue. This is 1 black mana. It's an uncommon for a sorcery. Target player reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it with converted mana cost 2 or less. That player discards that card. It has cleave for 2 and a black, and then can take any non-land card from their hand, not limited by mana value anymore. I don't like Cleave. We talked about it at length on our set review episode. My feelings have not changed on Cleave. I think it's a clunky way to do modal cards and one of my least favorite mechanics we've seen in a long time. That said, this card is an effect I love enough in my cube that I am going to have to just deal with it and forego that. Now, the Cleave cards, I think, are better when you just can shortcut them in your head. You don't have to actually read the awful card in your hands. You can just know what it does. And I think that's how this card is going to very often play. Also, as far as cleave cards go, the fact that it's pretty clean in that the restriction is very obvious and you just remove that restriction if you pay more mana is, I think, more straightforward than some of the clunkier cleave cards that remove different parts of rules text and you have to really process quite a bit to learn from. So I love hand disruption in my cube. We talked about my cube is very low curving, so a 1 mana to take a 2 mana spell, or a 1 mana or 2 mana spell is going to be very worth it most of the time. You're rarely going to whiff on that, for example. But then having that 3 mana mode, I think, is very relevant. It's a mode that'll let you basically, you're playing an aggressive deck, you're on turn 3 or 4, and the only out your opponent has is a board wipe. You just Dreadfuge them. And if they got a board wipe, you take it. And if not, you just go on to win the game handily. So I'm excited about the card. I'm going to have to put up with Cleave, even though it's not my favorite mechanic, because I just love hand disruption. I love all the options it chooses. I love the information you get when you see what your opponent chooses out of your hand to take from you and what you learn about what their hand might be from that interaction. And it's another 1 mana spell, and I just love cheap mana spells. So that's the one for me. Number 1 with a bullet.
I mean, let's just say you're not obligated to put up with it. You don't have to tolerate Cleave. If you don't like the mechanic enough, don't play it. It's just that you like all the benefits more, so
Yes.
that outweighs it. Every choice is a complicated sum of a lot of factors, and some of those are aesthetic, some of those are based on play patterns, some are based on power level, and you got to just add all those complicated pieces up and see if it comes out higher in the pro or con column for you.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I really liked the blood token mechanic. I loved playing with it at pre-release. I also really liked it even before I played with it. On our mechanics episode, I talked at length about how I thought it was a cool mechanic. There just didn't happen to be any blood token producing cards that I thought would be able to hang on terms of power level with my cube. And, my cube is the result of me making this calculus for many, many years, right? And deciding what cards I like and don't like and trying to come to some conclusion about them, because if I were to look at this set alone and try and make a cube just from the cards in this set, there'd be a lot of blood cards in it, but I also like Snapcaster Mage, and I also like Dark Confidant, and I also like Balance, and I also like Umezawa's Chite, and those cards are really powerful. And so if I want to play those cards and not have them be huge standouts and decide drafts and games as soon as they're cast and resolved, there's a certain power level bar that cards have to clear before they can really be considered. And in this case, Dreadfuge is powerful enough. The Cleave is bad, but it's not so offensive to me that I'm not going to run the card. And importantly, Anthony, we get a lot of really good red 2-drops. I think every set pretty much has a red 2-drop that's worth consideration or powerful enough that it could hang in my cube. We don't get that much 1 mana hand hate anymore that is relevant. I mean, the last time we got a really good one, I think, was Divest, maybe, with Dominaria. It's actually an interesting opportunity to talk about Drillbit. Drillbit is that 3 mana Thoughtseize that you can cast for Spectacle just for a black. And I won't redo my entire spiel about Light at the Stage, but I feel similarly about the relationship between Dreadfuge and Drillbit as I do between Light at the Stage and Reckless Impulse.
I think that's an interesting comparison we should go into at some point, because I think that's sort of maybe we should do a whole episode just on the 2 main phases. How about that?
I like that idea.
All right, great.
The main phase episode will be great. That took longer than I anticipated, Anthony. Hopefully it was useful. That's the summary of the cards I'm most excited about from my cube from the latest sets.
So I have only 4 cards for my regular cube.
Oh, great. It's
I'm
okay that I
interested
went a little bit long.
However, I do have 3 other cubes here that I have a couple cards to talk about, so we can see how deep and how weird we want to get.
Let's do the regular cube first, and then I think some of those are going to be short, right? You have... Here's
well,
the
don't
alternate...
spoil it.
Okay,
Don't spoil
I won't spoil it. All right, go ahead.
All right, so for the regular cube, which, to give this context, it is a much, much lower powered cube with some of my favorite cards that are around, good uncommon or not great rare kind of power level. And it's really focused on a lot of small overlapping themes and trying to create a really interesting dynamic draft environment. So the first card, I have 2 cards here that are kind of just new things I want to throw in and try. No surprise, I am always drawn to all the new great white cards. I'm the only cube designer who says this with every new set, but my white section is getting a little thick these days. And then I also have 2
Mine
cards.
is too, in my main cube. My cube's got 48 white cards, way more than any other color right now.
And that's okay.
I'm just saying you're not alone. Some people like white, even though it's only EDH players who don't like white. Let's be real.
It's true, but that's a vocal population.
And everybody's an EDH player eventually.
And then I have 2 other cards which are sort of very literal sort of sideways shifts to existing cards in the cube. So I think those are a little bit interesting to talk about as well. This first one I think is going to surprise you as much as your first choice, which is by invitation only.
I'm not surprised. And excited that you also consider it for your list. I thought about it for the regular cube when I was thinking about it for my cube as well.
So I think it's pretty interesting because one of the sort of features of this cube is, compared to something like Anti-Spun Magic Cube, a lot of effects you can kind of just say like, well, let's just add 1 mana to it and we kind of have this new power level. And that doesn't totally scale, and it's been a lot of like playtesting and iteration to figure out how different effects and their costs sort of scale differently. But that does hold true with the Wraths. So they're generally 5 or 6 mana, and they're honestly just not as impactful in shaping of the environment as they are in a lot of cubes, even though they are present. And I think that by invitation only is potentially a more interesting 5 mana Wrath because of that nature, that it doesn't need to go in this sort of dedicated control deck.
Right.
You really can just play it in your sort of like mid-rangey pile of creatures deck, which is a lot of sort of what this cube is about. So,
yeah, even control decks in your cube are just slower creature decks. Like, you're always winning with creature combat. And I mean, I guess technically in my cube, you're also always winning with creature combat, but often it's creature combat like...
You made a bunch
my
of
2
tokens.
Lingering Souls tokens that still survived and just were still around to kill you to death. It's not like your cube where you're like, I played a big flyer and eventually killed you with it, you know?
Right. So I think that this card might end up being a little bit overpowered, but because it just offers something that I think is really, really unique, it's worth giving a try. I'm not sure if I'm going to cut another Wrath or just throw it in, but we'll see what happens.
Do you think this card will affect the direction of your draft? Let's say you're playing a white deck, second pack, you open up by invitation only, you decide to take it. Is it going to change the pick orders of other cards, you think? And if so, in what way?
I think so. And we've talked about this a couple times, about sort of how key cards can sort of shape the perception and sort of create inroads into what you're drafting. And I think this really is one of those where I think currently you could definitely say, like, well, if we just like build the best deck you can that involves a bunch of Wraths in this cube, I think you could definitely make very solid decks. But I think that because they're a little bit more expensive, a lot of players are not as interested, they're not as appealing, so you just don't find those inroads as quickly. So I think this being a much more flexible Wrath does sort of provide that. So even if it doesn't really impact, you know, what the time-traveling supercomputer could do, I think it will impact the way people evaluate cards during a draft.
And you think they'll specifically try and be more controlling after they have it?
I think so.
Because that's my only concern. I'm also think it might be a little bit towards the top of the power level spectrum, which is, of course, fine. Some cards have to be at the top of the power level of every single cube. I just wonder if it's going to be like this goes in every single white deck. It doesn't matter how many creatures I'm playing. Nothing matters. Like, if I'm ahead on board, I cast it and then crush them. And if I'm behind on board, I cast it and wipe the board. And I wonder if it just becomes kind of a, like, it's so modal, and it is, as you mentioned, so good in 2 drastically different modes that it just doesn't matter what kind of white deck it's in. It's always good. Which I'm not sure, but maybe we'll find out.
Right, and I think that's actually a perfect summary of what I would evaluate this to be a failure. It's not a failure if it's just a powerful card. It's a failure if it just fits everywhere. You just draft it all the time. You don't really make decisions about it. And sometimes it just like wins the game in a way that feels sort of random and unintentional.
Yeah, I don't think this is a perfect comparison, but it did make me think a little bit of Extinction Event, which was in some ways similar, where I don't feel like you would take Extinction Event and go like, ooh, I'm the even deck now. I'm only going to take even costed creatures. It just was like, you take Extinction Event because it was a potential source of card advantage. You could, 2 for 1, 3 for 1 your opponent with it in some circumstances. And then sometimes you got to play in a way that it like really maximized it. Like, I've got it in your opening hand, you just skip playing your 3 drops and you only play your 2 and 4 drops and then cast it. Or your opponent's got a bunch of 2s, so you just cast your 3 drop and then cast it. But those didn't feel like the person was getting rewarded for savvy play. It was like, yeah, you did the obvious thing. You just, And this could be similar, where it's like, the modes are obvious. You just choose the best one, and it's always very relevant. The type of deck in my cube that I'm worried that the invitation only will be bad against is like a control deck. And our control decks are maybe where our cubes differ the most in terms of how they actually play. My control decks are almost pure answers with those incidental win conditions. They have man lands, they have Emeria's Calls, they maybe have a Planeswalker or 2, but the win conditions are like the absolute last consideration. All you're thinking about is, how do I remove all of my opponent's threats at all times and protect myself completely? And against that deck, by invitation only doesn't do anything, because they're not going to have anything to board wipe, they're not even going to have anything to, Plague Wind or whatever. It's just not really relevant. In your cube, that's not what the control decks look like. They are going to have creatures in play, no matter what state of the game it's at. They're going to be playing little cantripping creatures, good blockers, that kind of stuff. So it might be good all the time. We'll see.
So next up, this is a quick and easy one. Gryff Rider. So this is a 3-mana 2/1 with flying and training. Another just nice little white card.
This was right on the cusp of, am I going to run this in my pre-release deck? I ended up playing like a Mardu sealed pool for my pre-release deck, and I needed a couple more 3 drops, and this was competing with some other ones. And I ended up playing them and then siding them out sometimes, and they were good sometimes, they were bad sometimes, but I definitely got a very clear picture into why the training mechanic is more different from the mentor mechanic, maybe than we first initially touched on, which I think I was kind of like getting at it a little bit, but I did a horrible job articulating it and even understanding it myself, which is that my opponent had a board state in one of our sealed games where they had 2 of these things in play. And then it was like, if they draw a 3-power creature, I am just dead. It's like, and here, like, the training creatures, again, are the small creatures in the, like, training versus mentor comparison. Mm-hmm. And here, the fact that the keyword is distributed amongst these small creatures made it so much harder for me to, like, control the board with removal. Because if they had drawn a really good mentor creature with their 2 dinky flyers, they just kill the mentor creature. Whatever, it's all over. If they draw any 3-power creature now, doesn't matter what it is. It could be bad. It doesn't matter what it is. If they get to attack with it, they're going to make these 2 3/2s, which they did, and kill me with. So it's interesting that training seems much better in multiples than mentor was on cheap creatures.
That's interesting. Well, we're not going to have that here because this is the only one I'm adding. But I do feel like for some of those things you're touching on, like right now I think removal is feeling a little bit weak because there's maybe a little bit too much token generation, and some of the aggressive decks still have a little bit of trouble crossing the finish line and getting that reach. So I like, an evasive threat that interacts with combat, interacts with power matters, and interacts with counters. It just really hits in a lot of points that are, part of the goals and the sort of design structure for this cube. All right, for my next card, I think I'm finally going to do it. I think I'm finally going to add a double-faced card to this cube.
Oh, boy.
So this is one of 2 sort of pretty direct shifts between cards. So currently I have the card Adorned Pouncer in my cube, which is 1/1 with double strike and can reanimate it for 5 mana as a 4/4. Twinblade Geist, I think, is definitely a power downgrade, but I think it just hits all the points and reinforces the kind of gameplay I'm looking for so much more. So it's also 2 mana for 1/1 with double strike, but it has Disturb for 3, and it comes back as an enchantment that grants creature double strike. So it's similar in that it's, and I should say, I love double strike in a lot of ways. I feel like it's one of those keyword mechanics that just, you give any other mechanic to a card or any other ability to a card, and it just works so well with double strike, whether that's just increasing its power, putting counters on it, having combat damage triggers, all kinds of stuff. It's just such a cool thing to kind of mix and match. And Fencing Ace doesn't quite get there on power level. I don't think it would make it in decks pretty much ever. So I've wanted kind of this Fencing Ace with a little bit of upside. The problem with Adorned Pouncer for me is just that in decks that you're playing this, you're often not like really hoping to get to 5 mana and being able to reanimate it. So it's kind of like this bonus. But then once you do get there, it's just sort of linear. You're just sort of like, I do this now. Do you have a removal or a bounce spell? If not, you're kind of just dead, or you're at least in the abyss. So I like that Twinblade Geist is a much more interesting card that forces you to actually still have a board presence and really critically give you more choices, because now you get to double down on double strike and say, well, I can now mix and match this double strike with my creature that has counters on it, or just, has more power, or whatever else is going on, rather than this just much more linear gameplay of, I'm going to get this and it's going to sometimes be incredibly powerful.
I saw Twinblade Geist and was like, I hope Anthony puts this in the regular cube. Then I had the thought he probably wanted to DFC.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad to hear that you actually are doing it, because I think it fits perfectly with the kinds of combat things you like to include in the cube.
Right.
And for all the reasons you mentioned, you did a very good job articulating it. But I think it's great in that cube, and I'm excited for it.
Another small shift is Whispering Wizard. So currently I have Murmuring Mystic in the cube, which is 4 mana for a 1/5. I might be getting that wrong.
I think it's 1/5, yeah.
Which, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue bird illusion creature token with flying. I love this card. It's 4 is a little bit much maybe in this environment for the payoff, and maybe the spells theme isn't quite working, but I just love this card for, I don't know.
It's got great art. It's got great art. It's got a spell trigger. I also have an affection for that card.
So we have in Innistrad Crimson Vow, Whispering Wizard, which is again 4 mana for a 3/2. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, make a 1/1 white spirit token with flying. Oh no, I just finished reading the card. No! This ability only triggers once per turn?
That's kind of a big difference.
Okay, I think there's a whole bunch of interesting conversation that we can have, and then I'm just going to ignore this card and we can move on. So what I do really like about it is I don't necessarily love just how big and defensive the body on Murmuring Mystic is. I feel like it's very easy, especially when you're lowering the power level, just to, if you're not paying attention to it, get into like just big kind of grindy board stalls, and just replacing it with a more aggressive body, I think fits in really well with just keeping the games moving. It is a huge difference in that there is a fair amount of small removal, your shocks and your disfigures.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big knock on this card in terms of its power level. But it also triggers on all kinds of spells. So, your artifacts, your enchantments, whatever else you have.
As opposed to just its sorceries, which Marine Mystic triggers on.
Right, which sort of fitting into that bridging thing. Like the spells theme is not quite something that's really working all the time, but the artifact theme works a little bit better. So having a bridge card that kind of lets you get some payoffs from both, I think supports that really well. The last thing that I do really like about Whispering Wizard is just that it doesn't make a unique token. It just makes a token that's already there, which, again, that sounds kind of like a stupid aesthetic thing, but we're choosing from all 20,000 Magic cards. We can definitely afford to make those like minute decisions and allow that small pro to matter. And it's annoying to have all these different tokens.
I feel like maybe in the past couple sets, Wizards has actually gotten more okay with cards making off-color tokens. Like, we see that on Occult Epiphany, too. It also makes 1/1 white spirits. I feel like there's examples from the passive Magic, obviously, but I feel like there was maybe this idea that, it's weird if this Marine Mystic makes white spirits, but it's just not. It's fine.
It's also obviously a set that is spirits is a theme here, so it makes sense
there. Yeah, but it only triggers once a turn, Anthony.
That is a big downside. I'm embarrassed I didn't read that.
It's hard to read all the Magic cards, and to be fair, I'm not actually convinced it's a huge power level downside, but it's a huge complexity. Now you have to remember this thing, like, I double spelled and oops, I don't get the second trigger. I get punished now for playing efficiently downside, which I think is kind of a feel bad. It does have much worse art too.
That is the last thing I really have to mention or agree with, is that the worse art is, again, a pretty big downside.
Yeah, for a couple of reasons. I
to...
like Marine Mystic more. I only just noticed now that these are both alliterative names of spell casting wizards that have some sort of whisper or murmur. Like, why are they talking quietly? What's the flavor there?
I mean, the flavor of Murmuring Mystic makes a lot of sense to me. He's just wandering around, muttering to himself, and these birds are kind of, as he's thinking about spells, these birds are kind of appearing, and he's kind of not paying attention.
But then what's going on here? Why is this guy whispering?
That doesn't make any sense.
Also, why is he in a Tom Cruise movie with the Minority Report? He's in, he got that, the Minority Report screen going on in front of him. It's very odd.
Yeah.
I don't like this card. It does not spark joy.
Yeah. So I will say, obviously the only once a turn, let's just go ahead and delete this from my list right now. Okay. Bye. The only once a turn is obviously a power level downside. I don't think that is objectively worse, like as a game
No,
piece.
definitely not.
It's not that more powerful cards are better in any way, but I'm saying Murmuring Mystic is already kind of on the cusp where it doesn't always make it into decks as often. So it's like in the specific context, I think that is a power downside that makes this card just going to fit into less decks. More importantly than that, I think the like double spell turns is where you really have a lot of fun with these, and you're like,
that's the payoff for putting a 4-mana,
right.
Build around thing in your deck.
Like, I'll keep this cantrip in my hand because I know I'm going to be able to double spell the turn after.
Right.
And especially, because it's clearly very easy to miss that only once a turn caveat. It could be a real bummer if you put this in your deck without realizing it, and you go ahead and start making a bunch of spirits, and your opponent says, "Sorry, friend."
Yeah. Yeah. If they gave us a Marine Mystic that just triggered on non-creature spells and made 1/1 white spirits that were white, that's what I want.
One day. Given an infinite universe, all things are Magic cards. So that's all I've got for my regular cube. Not huge changes, but I think a couple little interesting points of discussion.
Can I ask about a card?
Absolutely. Ask about any card
Is it weird? Is this a weird vibe to ask about a card that you didn't include? Obviously, you didn't include most of the set.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you thought about Parish Blade Trainee. This is one of the other training creatures, 1 and a white for a 1/2 with training. And when it dies, you put its counters on target creature you control. So it kind of moves around its training counters.
I don't have a good reason. For some reason, this just doesn't excite me as much. But I agree that it definitely fits in all those same, categories.
Yeah, I asked because I think it's a little better than the Gryff. I'm more excited to play it in an aggressive deck than the Gryff.
Okay.
But
I'm going to write that down and think about it. I feel like flying is very important to some of the white aggressive decks. However, I've included maybe a few too many 3-mana 2-power flyers, so I could see that actually making more sense.
I feel like this one's obviously going to be easier to put a counter on, right? Because it's only got 1 power instead of 2 power. It's a little cheaper, which I'm, a sucker for cheap spells. And then that upside of being able to put that counter on something else feels like it ticks a lot of those boxes you like about give everything double strike.
For sure.
That counter's value could be a lot more valuable than just +1 to power and toughness, depending on where you put it. And those kinds of small decisions feel like something that the regular cube is often trying to encourage.
Right. Well, we could just try both.
Hit us with your other cubes, Anthony.
All right, where do you want to start? We got the Turbo Cube. We have the Irregular Cube.
Oh, just a regular cube next. I feel like a regular cube is spiritually a sister to the regular cube, not just in name, but also I feel like it's not that too far off in terms of power level. You're just kind of letting yourself have a little more leeway with the rare module cards.
Totally. It's sort of just, we're taking basically the same design philosophy of lots of small overlapping mechanics from the regular cube, but focusing on a different cluster of mechanics, which are all very much focused on the graveyard. So it's a lot of madness and flashback and looting, things like that. And additionally, we have this sort of idea of a set of rares, which we're going to shuffle a couple into. And so you have these kind of like interesting build-arounds. So full disclosure, this is a cube that's still in the works, but I still am thinking about it a bunch. So
hey, man,
got some new cards to
think about. A cube you think about a lot is a cube just as much as a cube that exists in a box somewhere in your house. I think that the thing that I think is important to note about your philosophy here of these rare cards is that we both like playing retail limited. It's fun to get like a powerful build around in a retail limited deck. One of the downsides of that kind of play pattern in cube is that it's the same cube every time. If you keep opening up the same powerful card and that's the same powerful card that keeps dictating your draft and deciding games, that can get old a lot more quickly than if it's only a once in a while kind of thing. And so the rare cards here are, can be more pushed in terms of power level because it's okay if they do dominate the drafting games a little more because it's only going to happen on the rare occasion that they're actually mixed in and opened.
Right. And when we say rare, I am not beholden to actually choosing cards that are actually printed as rares. It's just some cards that I want to appear occasionally.
Cards you want to appear more infrequently. They're infrequents.
So first up, just to talk about a couple of comments that I'm interested in. I'm really interested in blood tokens. Like you said, they are a lot of fun to play with. Just the ability to basically just add cycling 1 to any card in your hand, plus all the little interactions of just having extra permanence in play is really fun gameplay, I think, and is perfect for this environment where we're focused on the graveyard and being able to loot cards and things like that. Unfortunately, there aren't quite as many that really, I think, are great fits. Unfortunately, when we take a set, if we're really interested in a mechanic, when we slice it down, it's sort of like, well, okay, there's a couple cards that are sort of really, really narrow and want you to be in an environment where you have tons of this mechanic, so those aren't quite going to fit. We have a couple rares that are just much more overpowered for the set. We have a couple commons that are a little bit too niche and touch on a second mechanic we're not interested in. Maybe it's a tribal theme. And you don't end up with a ton when we talk about these set mechanics that are necessarily, a shoe-in for a more generic context. But the three that I think are going to make sense are Belligerent Guest, which is a 3-mana 3/2 with trample. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create a blood token. So it's 1 mana, discard a card, draw a card. We also have Blood Petal Celebrant, 1 and a red. For a 2/1, it has first strike when it's attacking, and when it dies, make a blood token. The last one I have is Bloodcrazed Socialite. This is 3 and a black for a 3/3 with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, you create a blood token, and when it attacks, you can sacrifice a blood token. If you do, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So I think all of these are pretty reasonable fits just to add a little bit of a splash of some blood tokens here or there. This environment definitely is a little bit powered down compared to the regular cube, both because I think that creating that sort of disparity of the power level between rares and the rest of the cube is sort of interesting. And also, like, when we're talking about madness and cycling, like a lot of these mechanics that have been around for a long time, the power level was just a lot lower, especially on creatures when we're looking at some of those older cards. So if we want to make madness really work, that's kind of a necessity. We do see in the Bloodcrazed Socialite, which whenever you attack, you can sacrifice the blood tokens. That's even stepping on that territory a little bit, where you kind of either use that blood token once to get in some extra damage, but because we don't have this environment where you're making a ton of these tokens, that text kind of doesn't really matter. So these are kind of just what I'm thinking at. I'm going to keep looking through these blood tokens and see if there are better fits. But overall, that's kind of where I'm thinking for adding a little bit of this mechanic into this environment.
I loved playing with and against blood tokens even more than I anticipated from reading the mechanic before we played pre-release. I think it's great, so I'm excited to see these in play in the Irregular Cube whenever we get to play it.
Soon. All right, so next up I have a couple rares for the same cube. So this is just such an exciting place because I have this big stack of cards and I can just add anything that's kind of like an interesting, fun build around, but maybe doesn't really make sense or is like too narrow, so you just don't want to see it all the time. We can just throw whatever we want in there. So the first thing I have there is Curse of Hospitality. This was actually something that I got to play in my pre-release deck. It's 2 and a red for an enchantment. The wording is bad, I have to say.
And he begins to read it.
The wording is definitely structured to allow it to work in a certain way in multiplayer, but essentially what it does is you enchant a player, all of your creatures, your opponent, I should say. All of your creatures have trample, and whenever you deal combat damage to your opponent, with each of those creatures, you get to exile a top card of your opponent's library, and you can cast it that turn, which I think just fits perfectly in this context of, I don't want to see this card all the time. These kinds of enchantments can be very tilting when you just don't have easy ways to interact with it, or just like on some board states, this is just going to be nuts. But taking this early in a otherwise low power context, and then being able to try and get as many evasive threats and cheap removal and playing around trying to maximize this, I think occasionally is going to be a fun time.
Yeah, I'm not sure we've talked explicitly about playing with your opponent's cards, but that is a widely beloved theme and mechanic in cube design. People love cards that let them play their opponent's cards, and part of it I think just stems from the impact of haha, I got your cards now, and doesn't that make you feel bad? But I also think it comes from this novelty of your deck works in a certain way, and you draft it to work a certain way, and there's the color pie and always restricting factors that keep you from being able to combine cards in novel ways. And this is a card now that lets you break some of those rules and combine cards in perhaps interesting ways they wouldn't otherwise be combined. And I think that's where a lot of the excitement comes from in playing with your opponent's cards.
Oh, absolutely.
Because really, if you look at it in one way, this is like a pretty bad coastal piracy, I think, is the curiosity for your entire team card, where you just draw a card every time a creature you control deals damage to your opponent, except the cards are probably pound for pound a little worse because they're not in your deck that basically has synergy with whatever your deck is doing. But I think that emotional upside of now I get to play this card that doesn't even fit in my deck and see how it combines with this creature is very fun. I have an EDH deck that's built around this, and it's a lot of fun to play with people's cards and have those novel interactions.
That's so true. When you have your 40-card deck, you've got your 23 non-land cards or whatever-ish. The number of ways those cards can interact is tremendous, but it is somewhat finite. You could imagine, what are the most extreme things this deck could do? Here's what I could do on turn one for my most powerful opener. And so having this one card that's you don't have those boundaries anymore. Anything could happen. You could flip a thing that just suddenly in this moment means, oh, I'm going to put this aura on my creature that's going to totally do this insane thing that I never thought of while building my deck. I think you're totally right. That
moment of excitement is very fun for people.
I think it's also not fun for some people as well.
Yes. Some people get tilted when
some
you play with their cards.
Some people don't like having their cards touched. But again, I think that's what's great about having this idea of these rares, because you're just not going to see this all the time.
Yep.
I promise I'm not too influenced by my pre-release pool, but I also threw Eruth, Tormented Prophet on this list, and I think this is a good card just to talk about in general, because I think it's very interesting, and I think a lot of cube designers will be interested in it. So this is 1 blue and red for a legendary human wizard. It is a 2/4, and if you would draw a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library instead, and you may play those cards this turn. So it's kind of just like your own personal Howling Mine, but you're exiling the cards. I don't know. What do you think of this card?
I don't know what to make of this card.
I think that's why I like it.
The revealing the cards is a downside, and then especially in decks that have blue in them, this is a better example of the counter spells being a lot worse with this card than I think Reckless Impulse is, because you got 1 Reckless Impulse in your deck, you're only going to reveal 2 cards. If you happen to reveal a counter spell, whatever, this is going to replace every single draw you have for the rest of the game. Now, every single card you draw is a known quantity, right? I know what your hand is, essentially. You have a hand left over from before you cast Eruth or Resolved Eruth that is still some hidden information, but a lot of public information, and you can only play them this turn. So
it really doesn't work with counterspells.
Really doesn't work with counterspells unless you have a way to draw cards at instant speed, but that way you have to draw cards at instant speed has to be a permanent in play or a card that was already in your hand before you resolved Eruth. And so for that reason, it's really just a very proactive card, but it's a 3-mana 2/4, which is not a very proactive body. So I don't really know what to make of it. And honestly, I thought it would feel more powerful than it felt in our pre-release games.
That could be my fault.
I don't think it's your fault. You had a game where you resolved Eruth on turn 3, and then I thought, well, I'm dead very quickly. And you continued to resolve more bombs, and somehow I survived really far into the late game. You eventually won, but it took a long, long time, long enough that our match eventually ended in a draw. But I was not scared of it. I wasn't oh no, this is a huge problem. As it played out, I was oh, this seems fine. You just hit all your land drops, basically. Is kind of what it came down to.
Yeah, it does help with that. Yeah, this is in this weird little space where it's I'm interested in collecting this pile of cards that are difficult to evaluate in a lot of ways and maybe have really interesting upsides.
I love cards that are difficult to evaluate.
So I think that it is a really good fit for that particular context. I think it also could be a good fit in plenty of other places. But yeah, finding ways to sort of break that parity and figure out, like, it was really interesting, especially with blood tokens, when I had this in play on turn 3, and then those 3 cards left in my hand were discard fodder that basically each said draw 2 cards. Because I knew I was going to make a bunch of blood tokens throughout the rest of the game. So it just led to a really interesting minigame.
Yeah, I would say more data required before I can tell you what I think about this card. But on its face, I think it's kind of like in conflict with itself a little bit. Make this a 3/3 with prowess or something, and then I'm like all in. But as a 2/4, it's like, what are you doing?
Prowess would have been great.
Prowess would have been really
Prowess
great.
is a great mechanic.
This could have been a 2/2 with prowess, and I think it would have been pretty messed up, to be honest.
Yeah. All right, another weird one. Again, I just want to talk about some weird cards.
That's what we're here for.
I've thrown Ancient Lumberknot on the list. So this is a 4-mana 1/4. Each creature you control with toughness greater than its power assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So this is a slightly wordier version of the
Doran the Siege Tower.
What's that?
Assault Formation.
This is a slightly wordier version of the Assault Formation text, where all your creatures go in butts first, but they've tweaked it so if your creature actually has lower power than its toughness, it doesn't get smaller. So it's...
I actually didn't notice that when I read this card. Like, I saw the words toughness greater. I saw the words like, and it just like in my head, my brain like completed that sentence to just like the Assault Formation text.
That's a weird kind of complexity, but that's definitely real. So I think that Assault Formation is very interesting, and I actually had an opportunity maybe a month or two. We did a flashback conspiracy Take the Crown draft, and I drafted Weight Advantage, which is a conspiracy that just gives you that effect all the time, which conspiracies are just the most busted build-arounds because you always have access to them, so you can lean really hard into it. And it definitely was weird that like that downside did make a bunch of my creatures worse, but it was overall very powerful. And so I might be a little bit influenced by that just that specific change in the rules text, where this isn't such a build around where I need to totally like warp my draft, because it's not going to make any of my creatures worse, but it does have pretty serious upside, and the floor is a 4-mana 4/4. So I think this isn't a build around in the same way of a lot of these others where it's like really, really powerful. I don't think it's a huge power outlier even in this context, but as something that is just sort of the less oppressive example of something like Weight Advantage or Assault Formation, I think it's kind of interesting.
I'm coming out swinging here. I don't think this makes any sense for the rare module. Get Doran the Siege Tower in there. If you're going to do this effect, you should do it. Doran, 3-mana 5/5. Actually worth pulling you into that effect instead of this 4-mana 4/4, which doesn't pull you into it. Actually a risk because it affects all of your creatures, but also can punish your opponent because they have a bunch of, creatures with more power than they have toughness. You play Doran, it's symmetrical across the entire board, baby.
True. Yeah, that's... All right. I mean, this is why we have these conversations. I've also toyed with the idea a little bit of just putting in... In fact, maybe I already do have Weight Advantage in that list, just because, I mean,
Weight Advantage also works. I mean,
Conspiracy is another perfect card type where it's like, I do not want to play with him all the time, but every once in a while.
But this effect, this Assault Formation rules text, I think is the perfect kind of thing to have be a occasional thing, because
right. Exactly.
It does dramatically change the evaluation of a lot of cards. Like, a lot of cards get a lot better, a lot of cards get a lot worse. I've seen cubes that have a whole deck built around this, but then honestly it becomes kind of like a one-note thing. It's like, all right, you put in all the cards that are really good with Assault Formation, great. It's way more fun to me when you have to, like, pick through cards that are otherwise playable on their own, but are slightly recontextualized with this new rules text. And I just like Doran as the cleanest version of that effect that also is the biggest pull in terms of raw power level. Also, I like the idea of the person playing that deck wanting to play more colors anyway, to play more of the cards that have more benefit from this change in the power and toughness, which you can maybe get with a 3-color card like Doran.
Right, it's funny how it sort of focuses you on a more narrow set of cards, but to get those narrow set of cards, you actually have to branch out more.
So your pool's bigger, so
like
you get to
tree
pull.
Folk.
There you go. I see what you did there.
That was kind of a found pun. Anyway, one more that I thought was interesting is the Patchwork Crawler. So this is 2 mana, 1 and a blue for a 1/2 for, it's a zombie horror. You may pay 3 mana to exile a creature card from your graveyard, put a counter on Patchwork Crawler, and it gains all activated abilities of all cards exiled with it. This is similarly, it's just like one of these really cool, what's the older card? Not Necrotic Ooze.
Necrotic Ooze is the one that has all abilities of all creature cards in your graveyard.
This is a little bit tamer. It has the fail case of if you're kind of late in the game, you can kind of just get some counters and still have a creature.
Pretty bad Scavenging Ooze, but still a Scavenging Ooze nonetheless.
So yeah, I'm curious to see how that'll play out. I'll definitely do a little bit more of a careful review of the list and see if there are enough activated abilities for it to really pay off. But it's, again, like that perfect oh, I have this cool rare. Can I actually assemble a deck that can, combine 2 different activated abilities to turn this into something much more than the sum of its parts?
I like that one as a just like throw a bone to the rare pile. Like, can someone do something with this? Let's find out. And it's only possible because the Irregular cube has this big power delta, right? Like,
right.
I can't just put this in my cube. It would be stone unplayable. You would never draft it, never take it. It would never do anything. Even your regular cube, this would be pretty awful in, I think, and wouldn't see any play. But the commons, as it were, the core of the Irregular cube is enough lower power level that like maybe a 2-mana 1/2 that grows is just fine as a baseline, enough so that you're willing to like take it on a bit of a hedge and then maybe find a way to combine the cards to make something cool happen with it. I do have a small complaint about this card. Why does it have to be my graveyard? Why can't I start combining stuff from my opponent's graveyard and use their abilities too? That sounds cool.
No disagreement from me.
That'd be even more patchworky.
God, the illustration on this is also really something.
Truly horrific.
It's great job. Who?
I'm trying to read that name too right now.
It's too blurry.
It's Fezbra. Fezbra, you're a true sicko. True sicko mode, Fezbra.
We respect that. All right, so that's what I've got for the Irregular cube. Do you want to talk about the Turbo cube?
I absolutely want. That's my favorite cube to talk about. Let's do it.
Okay, great.
It's turbo time!
So I've got a couple cards here for the Turbo Cube. We can summarize this one really quickly. It's a very simple cube with just one small tweak on the rules of Magic the Gathering. All spells and activated abilities cost 2 less, 2 generic mana less.
Yep.
Easy. So everything's broken. You do a whole bunch of stuff on turn 1.
Everything's broken and the points don't matter.
Exactly.
The show where everything's made up and the points don't matter.
But it's actually a little bit more playable than I expected it would be.
It's very playable, and you haven't included any of the egregiously broken. I mean, well, I guess you could argue the eggs are egregiously broken, but you haven't included the cards that are just like
that is
like
true.
1 card infinite combos or stuff like that. So I think the cube is entirely. I think it's a healthy balance format.
That's amazing.
It's just like a healthy balance format. It's like there's different kinds of racing, right? And there's like you can have balance equal racing at like the go-kart track. And this just happens to be like Formula 1 cars that are like shot full of nitrous oxide. But they're all doing it. So, it's maybe your car goes into turn 1 and bursts into flames and just flies into the grandstands. I've had decks that have done that before. Maybe you get to, win by a huge margin. It's a cool cube. I like it a lot.
Okay, so there are 2 pretty easy includes. This is the one cube that I maintain that is sort of like power maxed. Like with some exceptions, I'm trying to push things in as powerful as possible and taking the most game actions possible.
Or specifically, like when you're looking at the new set, you're just like, filter by, how many things are free?
Yep.
Are the free spells any good? Do I want to include them? Which is a much simpler way to curate a cube than trying to find effects you like and that kind of stuff.
It really is. So there are 2 sort of easy ones. Investigator's Journal, 0 mana, enters the battlefield with the number of suspect counters equal to the greatest number of creatures a player controls. 2 mana to remove a counter from it to draw a card. And you can also pay 2 mana and sacrifice it to draw a card. So assuming there is a creature in play, this is a free divination. And if there are creatures, it is a free Howling Mine until eventually it's draw 3, I guess, on 1 turn. No, it's still you just draw two cards on 1 turn. So very solid card. Cards like Maze Mind Tome and Sunset Pyramid have been really sought after because you can dump your hand pretty quickly. So sources of card advantage
is actually very relevant,
very meaningful. So this is going to be a very powerful and highly drafted card. Similarly, I'm not quite as sure about this one, but Pointed Discussion. So it's 2 and a black for a sorcery. You draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, make a blood token. Is another interesting one where you just generate some card advantage. It does cost a mana, which is a little steeper, but I'm curious about how much that like blood token to then cycle another card in your hand might be relevant.
I'm interested in that too. We'll see how much that blood token is actually worth. I think historically, like you are happy to play a divination or 2. I say divination; they all become 1 mana draw 2s. But to your point, anything that costs mana. I've told you before, when I draft this cube, it's like, is there anything I can do for free in this pack? And if there is, I'm not even looking at the cards I have to spend mana on unless they are exactly Monastery Mentor, Sai, one of the things that pays me off for doing all the free stuff.
All right, so 2 more that I think are a little bit more challenging. What do you think about Demonic Bargain? So this is another sorcery, 2 and a black, exile the top 13 cards of your library, search your library for a card and put it into your hand, then shuffle. I've been really hesitant about Demonic Tutor just because I honestly don't love tutors, and the combo-y decks are already a little bit overpowered.
They're already a thing. They're not struggling.
Exiling 13 cards is a huge cost, especially when you're just churning through your deck super quickly with all kinds of effects, and you can mill yourself pretty easily.
Yeah, I don't like this card because I do think it's kind of a trap. I think you're going to mill yourself a lot more often than you're going to benefit from the power of this card being a 1-mana tutor. Like, the reason to not play Demonic Tutor in my mind is that you just go and get an egg, and then it effectively is a mana positive spell. It's just another copy of an egg most of the time. And sometimes you have more mana and you go and get your payoff, but most of the time you just get an egg, right? And it just, now you have another copy of an egg in your deck, which you could never do with Demonic Bargain because you wouldn't exile half your remaining library or whatever just to go get an egg out of it to draw more cards. So I don't know. I don't think it's that great, and I'm not particularly interested in tutors in this environment because there's so much cycling. You can find the cards you care about.
Right, like that's kind of the fun part.
You just churn through that's a great way of putting it. That's the fun of the Turbo Cube is like, I got this big deck. Let's see how fast I can put it in my graveyard and or hand and do stuff with it. And just like getting a tutor to kind of like skirt around that is like, all right, great, cool, you did it. I don't know. Not that into it personally.
Okay. I think that's a great discussion.
Cool art.
We're happy to exclude it. Great art. Love everything Sam Gway does. All right, one last card here for the Turbo Cube. What do you think about Cemetery Gatekeeper, which we've already talked about? But again, you exile a card from
the red Punisher
a
card,
graveyard, and it punishes people for casting spells of that type.
I like it. I think it's cool. I think it's worth a mana here. It probably is just going to choose Artifact all the time. And
definitely agree.
Almost always going to be an Artifact in the graveyard. Even if you're on the play, you can put an Artifact in your graveyard on turn 1 very, very often and then just cast this thing and exile an Artifact. And I think it's cool that it's symmetrical. So it's going to be like, you get to maybe like do... We've talked before about how I think that a Staxi or Punisher deck could kind of work here, but one of the big problems is that if you get to go first, you just do all the stuff, dump your whole hand, and then at the end, play your Punisher or Stax cards,
right.
And then your opponent just never gets to do all the stuff you did because that Punisher or Stax card exists. And here, this is not as extreme as something like a Null Rod or a...
Damping Sphere, Thorn of Amethyst.
Or Damping Sphere or Thorn of Amethyst or one of these other Stax cards that would like really kind of like break the whole conceit of the cube, where you just do your whole thing, then you play Thorn and say, haha, now, you don't get to play.
Although those cards might be coming in the near future as well.
I would love to just try it. I mean, this is a perfect example of like, I think a lot of people, especially very overthinking cube designers that listen to this podcast, might be like, I got to be so careful to not break my environment. Break your environment. See how it goes. Play it. I think Thorn's
fix it.
I think Thorn's probably going to be messed up, but I'm curious to see how it's messed up and see exactly what it leads to in the games. But this is like that, but it's not game ending. It's like, all right, now I took 12 damage on the first turn, which wasn't part of the plan, but can I come back from that? I think is an interesting line, as opposed to being like, oh, you played Thorn. Now my whole hand of free spells that normally do nothing except for draw more cards, now I'll cost 1 mana to do nothing but draw more cards, which is a non-starter, basically.
Right. I mean, that is exactly my concern, is that the most dangerous thing about this environment is how advantaged you are being on the play. And so I don't want to further sort of... I don't want to make that asymmetry even more extreme, that just if you're on the play, you dump your hand and then you finish with Thalia or something and your opponent's just kind of shut out of the game. And I think this could definitely fall into that territory where you cycle a bunch of eggs and all that kind of stuff, exile an artifact, and then your opponent's looking at a hand where they're going to legitimately take 12 damage before they start doing anything, and then they're still getting attacked by a 2/1 first striker. So I think it's worth trying, but I could see this being another piece that's slightly pushing the cube more in that direction.
You know what I would take in the Turbo Cube above any egg ever printed is Power Play, the conspiracy that says if you're not going first, you get to go first.
I said that this is a cube where I'm trying to play the most powerful cards to some degree. That is way off the table.
Yeah, that would be
absolutely not.
That would be pretty punishing.
All right, I have one more weird dumb cube.
I will have I'll put a censor beep earlier over my allusion to this cube, so people will have wondered what that beep was. And now we're getting the beep spoiled.
So a little while ago, I actually wrote into Good Luck High Five, another Magic podcast that we love. If you haven't already been listening to them, you should go do that. Don't listen to this podcast.
Do both. Listen to ours too.
Okay. I asked them what kind of cubes they would be interested in, and I forget if it was Megan or Maria, but one of them suggested a cube with all the alt win conditions. And I said, that's cool. No one should build that. That's going to be horrible. And then I couldn't stop thinking about it.
The ones to see it is planted.
It's really a problem. So I did design this cube. I'm calling it the Battle of Wits cube, and I tried to get every single alt win condition into the list, although Battle of Wits turned out to be problematic, so it didn't actually make it into the list.
Why was it problematic?
Because you have to have so many basic lands.
This is what this episode is about now. Now this episode is about the battle. You could make the Battle of Wits deck work. You just also have to have the cards that, let you exile a bunch of lands from your library.
Right.
Wait, does Battle of Wits only work when it's in play and you have that many cards?
Correct. So you do have to have more than 200 cards.
My point is still, you can't I thought for some reason in my head I had a shortcut to like a companion text, like as long as you started the game with 300 cards in your library, Battle of Wits says you win the game, but they still have to be in your library when it's on the battlefield, which means you can't like consultation yourself to find your Battle of Wits and then play it.
So the challenge is just getting enough support for every single alt-win condition in the same set of 360, 384 cards so that you can theoretically actually play these.
None of them are huge traps.
And then it actually turned out to be a really interesting challenge just to sort of try and like reconstruct Magic. So the rules tweak is that you don't lose the game for running out of life. You can't pay life.
Oh, you did change that.
We do need to have that because otherwise you can just kill people. That's not fair. You can just attack people to death.
Is that not fair?
Yeah, that's not fair
I
at
would
all.
have assumed it'd be really, really hard in the alternate win condition cube to just attack people to death. Why not let people do it if they can?
I mean, you can try. It is interesting that life totals do still matter for a lot of the win conditions and for
transcendence or whatever
alternate costs that pay life. So it turned out to be a really interesting design challenge where it's like, well, how do we actually restore the interactivity when these payoffs, these like ways to end the game, don't interact on normal terms? So I went pretty deep on it. The list is really, really tight, and unfortunately now I do have to add Faithbound Judge. My hands are tied. I'm obligated to add it in. It is 1 white for a 4/4 defender, flying, vigilance. At the beginning of your...
Do you have to read this whole card?
No.
The backside says you win the game in 3 turns after you disturb it for 7 mana.
That's exactly what it says. So I don't know what I'm going to cut. It's going to be really challenging. Everything is really tight and they're very intentionally at this point.
All right, well, listeners, I'm going to put the link to Anthony's alternate win condition cube in the show notes, and everybody send him your cuts for that cube.
Oh, that'd be great.
Give you a nice big fat list. There's nothing cube designers love more than telling people what they should cut from their cubes. So do it for Anthony's alternate win condition cube.
I do think this cube was a really interesting exercise and just like not a thought challenge, just a regular challenge. It was really hard to design something that felt meaningful, a puzzle. So I don't think anyone should play this cube. I don't think anyone should build a cube, but I do like sort of planting this flag way, way out in the field just to say, look how like huge and weird we can get with cube design and how much space there is in the much more reasonable end of the spectrum.
I think we should play it once.
All right.
I had to proxy the whole thing up. We're not buying all those freaking cards. It's not going to happen.
You say that.
Is that it for your cubes, Anthony?
That is it for my cubes.
I'm going to save our listeners from talking about the Combat Trick Mini Cube. There are a couple things I'm going to add from this set. The main important one is the 2-mana blue flyer that just draws a card whenever you target it with a spell. That's a slam dunk in that cube and will be in there for all time. And I think I'm going to add Occult Epiphany as a discard outlet for the Degenerate Micro Cube, which also can serve as a rare win condition, but leave that out. I did save, Anthony, my number 1 card from Crimson Vow. Didn't even mention it in my top 10. The number 1 card above all else from the set, and that is a braid, just because I love a braid and I'm excited to have art that I don't hate. I've always found the older braid art to be so boring, and I guess it's some like pyramid that's getting blown away in the wind, but it's like no, the composition's boring, the color's boring, and the newer braid art, does it have a lot to do with the braiding? I don't know. You could argue not, but it sure as heck looks cool. It's got this big like phoenix bird in the background and this geometric shape and this really stark silhouetted profile. I'm very into the new art. So that's actually truly the card I'm most excited about from this set is a foil new art of braid.
I'm excited to make that exact same strict upgrade in my cube as well. I also really I think these are pretty strict upgrades on Syncopate and Valorous Stance as well.
Ooh, I don't know about Syncopate. The Teferi Syncopate is pretty chill, but I do agree on Valorous Stance. The colors on the new Valorous Stance are quite nice. Love that composition. Love those colors. Old ones were also dark. Very dark and dingy. Thus concludes part 2 of our Crimson Vow and Crimson Vow Commander set review. All the cards we are going to add to our respective cubes. This is the first time doing an episode like this. I hope this was enlightening and useful to you. If maybe your cubes are somewhat similar to ours. Even if not, I hope hearing our takes on these cards in specific environments might help you process how other cards might work in your environment. And the last part of this set review is, of course, going to be your opinions. So we are collecting our answers for the community set review, which means we have a survey up at luckypaper.co/survey/VOW. It's got all the Crimson Vow cards, all the Crimson Vow Commander cards, all in one place. You can rate them, tell us what you think about them, how excited you are about them in your own cube lists. We're also accepting voice memo hot takes. If you want to have your opinion enshrined forever on an episode of Lucky Paper Radio, take out your phone, record a little audio clip of you sharing your opinion about a card, and we will add it into our community episode. Send those to mail@luckypaper.co.
So we didn't try and cover the whole set by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, we did cover the whole set for our cubes.
But not for all cubes.
No, just for our cubes.
So whatever you think that we've missed and you want us to talk about in the next set review set where we're going to be talking about the community response, make sure you go fill out the survey. And if you've already updated your cube on Cube Cobra, if you just put in the link, it'll automatically import all those cards and you can choose your ratings.
Because Anthony is a whispering wizard of web development. A whispering web wizard.
Oh, I hate that.
You're whispering because of how much I have to turn the input up on your mic, and you're a wizard because of how good you make that survey to fill out for people. Yeah, I mean, actually, truthfully, what that survey is you telling us to talk about a card on the community response episode of our set review. So if you want to talk about a card, your favorite card, include it in your survey and also include a little note or voice memo. If you include a voice memo, we're definitely going to talk about your card. If you just want to include a note in the comment section, we'll also be reading those comments, and that might also influence what we talk about on the show. That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. Our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. The Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Speaking Into Microphones in Anthony's basement. Thanks for talking about Magic cards with me, Anthony.
Anytime.